Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ruth Cohen, and I am the director of the Center for Lifelong Learning here at the American Museum of Natural History. On behalf of my colleagues, it is my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for what promises to be a stimulating, engaging conversation with one of the greatest physicians and storytellers of our time, Dr. Oliver Sacks. First, a couple of housekeeping details. Turn off your cell phones. They interfere with lifelong learning. No flash photography, please, in deference to our guest. Please take a moment at the end of the program to give us your feedback through the evaluation forms that have been handed out. For your trouble, we will enter you into a raffle to win tickets to the Margaret Mead Film Festival coming up here in November 10th through 13th, opening night or closing night, and you get a party. Tonight's lecture is part of a number of programs throughout the year that the museum produces to welcome audiences of all ages and all levels of curiosity to learn and experience science and culture. Our monthly Science Cafe series, a new adult course in a series on the science of attachment and other brain sciences, the parent-child bond coming up. You've seen some of these things on the screen. Our beloved documentary film festival, the Margaret Mead Film Festival, which is a feast of independent visions of world culture. And also opening November 19th, Beyond Planet Earth, the future of space exploration, which will be our latest exhibit. Hope to see you back here in November. Now it is my great privilege and pleasure to introduce Oliver Sacks and welcome him back to the museum. Dr. Sacks' influence is wide and profound and reaches medicine, science, culture, the arts. He is a doctor who has changed the practice of neurology. He is a philosopher who has changed how we perceive ourselves as humans, and indeed the very definition of perception. He is a storyteller and artist who can draw portraits that reach our hearts as well as our minds and expand our compassion and understanding of one another. In the preface to his new book, The Mind's Eye, Dr. Sacks states that it is the patient's description of their experiences that stimulates exploration, that is the starting point of any treatment or diagnosis. Tonight, he will take us all on these amazing explorations. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Oliver Sacks.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a great pleasure being here in the museum again, in my favorite museum, which I've come to almost every weekend since '65. I'm delighted to see some members of the deaf community here and an interpreter. And I hope and you should watch him when you lose interest in what I'm saying. I will also say, since someone has been flashing a red light at me, that I'd prefer no photography. My retinas are sensitive and I don't want to be distracted. I think I should say a little bit about how this book started. Am I audible to all of you? Yes. Okay, I know I'm distressingly visible, and I wish I weren't. I took my degree in medicine in 1958. I've been seeing patients ever since. But in the 90s, I didn't write any extended case histories. Although I continued to see patients, I diverted myself with writing a memoir, Uncle Tungsten, and a travel journal, my Oaxaca journal. But then in 99, a patient came to see me. I think she had read The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and she wondered, no photography, please. She wondered if something similar was going on with her. She gave me a story of how 9 years earlier, her name was Lillian Kalir. She was a very eminent concert pianist. There had been a change in a program, a sudden switch to a different Mozart piano concerto, and she flipped open the score to look at it and found it unintelligible. She saw everything clearly, the notes, the clefs, but it made no sense to her. And then some years later, she became unable to read, although she could still write, and she wrote me a letter. When I saw her, I found she could recognize almost nothing in the office, and I was bewildered as to how she had made her way to the clinic and how she managed. Shortly after she left, I couldn't find my medical bag, and then she came back saying that she'd been in a taxi and discovered that she had my medical bag. She said, "I am the woman who mistook the doctor's bag for her handbag." She said, but she had seen the scarlet tip of my reflex hammer there, and that gave her the clue. The one thing which had stood out when I examined her was that she was extremely sensitive to colors. I couldn't understand how she made sense of a visual world until I visited her apartment and found that everything was classified in terms of color, position, association. So she could recognize nothing in the ordinary way, but everything in an artificial way. She became very dear to me, as did her family. And when my father, who was a general practitioner in London, visited patients, he always looked in the refrigerator. I was not quite that bold, but Lillian would always provide me with schmaltz herring when I came on a neurological visit. And I think it's no good becoming a doctor to one's friends, but it's okay becoming friends with one's patients or one's doctors. And the first extended case history I'd written in 10 years then was my history on Lillian Kalir. This started me off. I then found myself thinking of a patient in the hospital where I worked, Beth Abraham Hospital in the Bronx. This was someone I'd known since 1991, a woman with a devastating aphasia and quite unable to express herself in language, and not very good at understanding language, although preternaturally acute in reading people's facial expression and their gestures, the tone of voice, and so forth. And in a remarkable way, she had become an amazing communicator, and I wrote about her as well. I hope the sipping is not monstrously amplified, but or can you hear my heartbeat? The last time I was here, I got very upset by the microphone, which was in my field of vision, and I felt it was like a fly around my face. But now, as I will mention, I can see nothing to the right. I can't see this. If it was on my left, I could see it. In fact, I only realized it was there when I looked in a mirror. I'm sorry I looked in a mirror, otherwise I would be blissfully ignorant. I think I'm so for me, writing and stories and thoughts start from individual patients. There's no intention early on about writing about a patient, and with Pat, the woman with aphasia, I had seen her for 12 years before it occurred to me to write about her. And then, of course, I spoke to her daughters, and she herself indicated with gesture that I should go ahead. I think I will tell you a little bit about another patient, although I shouldn't really. She was really as much a collaborator as a patient. In fact, she wasn't a patient. I had met her in 1996. At that time, I was very interested in space flight, and her husband, Dan Barry, was an astronaut. And I went to one of his launch parties. And there was his wife, Sue Barry, and I noticed something slightly odd about her gaze. And she came up to me and she said, "You've noticed something slightly odd about my gaze." She said, "With your neurological eye." And I said, "Oh," I sort of tried to apologize, and she said, "No, that was okay." There was something slightly odd about her gaze. She indicated that she had been born with her eyes crossed, that there had been various operations to straighten the eyes, and although no one but a neurologist would notice anything amiss, in fact, each eye acted independently, and the right side was scanned with the right eye, and the left side with the left eye. So the eyes were not in alignment. She was not seeing with both eyes simultaneously. I said, "Can you imagine what seeing with both eyes would be like? Can you know what stereo vision would be like? Because you need both eyes to see in 3 dimensions." And she thought a bit and said, "Yeah, I think so." She said she was a professor of neurobiology, that she'd read all the basic papers on stereo vision, and yes, she could imagine it. But then she sent me a letter nearly 9 years later, recalling this conversation, and she said, "I was wrong." And she said she could say she was wrong because now she had developed stereo vision. And she felt it as a great wonder and a great blessing. And she said that no one who didn't have stereo vision could imagine it. And she'd been wrong. And she sent me a chunk of her visual journal, which was very lyrical and very accurate. She took great delight in this. She described how it had happened. She'd gone to see a behavioral optometrist and been put through various tests. And after one of these sessions, she went out to her car and she said she saw the steering wheel thrusting out, popping out from the dashboard. And first she thought this was some strange illusion, but then she closed one eye and then the other, and she could only see this with both eyes. And this for her was the first time in her life she had seen in 3D. She said she was very puzzled because it was her impression and her doctor's impression that if one didn't have stereo vision by the age of 2, one would never get it. And she was 50. Well, I get lots of letters from people. A lot of the letters make sad and painful reading, where people describe some loss, something which has gone wrong. This was a different letter because it was jubilant and it described how something wonderful had happened. And I was very puzzled and slightly suspicious because it seemed impossible to me. But I made one of my remote house calls. She lived up in Massachusetts. I love going on neurological house calls. The further, the better. And I went along with 2 colleagues, an ophthalmologist and a visual physiologist. When I tested her, things were clearly genuine. I showed her some slides which could not be made sense of unless one had stereo vision. And so she clearly had it. So one of the 7 pieces in the mind's eye is called Stereo Sue. She started signing her letters Stereo Sue, and she's called Stereo Sue in the book. If I can find it, I'm just going to read a paragraph from the end of her journal. She said, "After almost 3 years, my new vision continues to surprise and delight me. One winter day, I was racing from the classroom to the deli for a quick lunch. After taking only a few steps from the classroom building, I stopped short. The snow was falling lazily around me in large, wet flakes. I could see the space between each flake, and all the flakes together produced a beautiful 3-dimensional dance. In the past, the snow would have appeared to fall in a flat sheet in one plane, slightly in front of me. I would have felt like I was looking in on the snowfall, but now I felt myself within the snowfall, among the snowflakes. Lunch forgotten, I watched the snowfall for several minutes, and as I watched, I was overcome with a deep sense of joy. A snowfall can be quite beautiful, especially when you see it for the first time." Sue has now, the New Yorker published my piece on Sue, and Sue has gone on to write a very good book of her own. One reason I wrote about her was that I started to realize, as she did, that there must have been thousands or tens of thousands of people in her position who have never seen in 3D, but who could learn to see in 3D. And so I think it's worth making that public. I myself had a passion for stereo photography and 3D, and when I was a boy I used to make what are called hyperstereoscopes, which basically put your eyes a yard apart and may enable you to see distant mountains or buildings in 3D. And I used to come to the museum regularly every month to the monthly meetings of the New York Stereoscopic Society. This obviously had prompted my question to Sue back in '96, can you imagine stereoscopy? Just about a year, a little less than a year after seeing Sue, something happened to me and to my vision. When this happened, I started keeping a journal, many journals. I am going to read you a little bit about how things started. It was in December of '05. Saturday morning, I'd gone for a swim, and then I went to a movie. But before the movie started and the previews, something suddenly started up, a glittering, flashing light to my left. and I was puzzled. I thought first it might be a visual migraine. One can get zigzags and bright lights with visual migraines, but this was clearly different, and it was clearly just affecting one eye. And I got panicked. I thought, am I going blind in that eye? Am I bleeding? Have I detached a retina? Or is it nothing? Will it just be better in 5 minutes? I stayed for part of the film, although I really didn't see any of the film because I spent all the while testing my visual fields. I found that I had lost a wedge-shaped slice of vision in the sort of between 9 and 11. I phoned up my ophthalmologist friend, the one who had come with me to Stereo Sue. He lived far away, but he said, go see an ophthalmologist immediately. And so usually I'm at the doctor end, but now I was at the patient end. A couple of hours later, I was in the ophthalmologist's consulting room. I told my story again, indicated the quadrant of blindness in my right eye. He listened carefully, looked non-committal, and after checking my visual fields, took his ophthalmoscope and peered into the eye. Then he put down the instrument, leaned back and gazed at me, I thought, with different eyes. There had been a certain lightness or casualness in him before. We were not exactly friends, but we were colleagues. Now suddenly, I was in a quite different category. I see pigmentation, he said, something behind the retina. It could be a hematoma, or it could be a tumor. If it's a tumor, it could be benign or malignant. He seemed to take a deep breath. Let's look at the worst case scenario, he continued. I cannot be sure what he said, for a voice had started up in my head shouting, cancer, 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 and I could no longer hear him. Well, 2 days later, I saw a specialist, and he confirmed that this was a cancer, a melanoma, behind the retina. He indicated this actually not verbally, but with a model. He had a model of an eye, and then he took something which looked like a small, shriveled black cabbage, and he put this in the eye, and that said to me, melanoma. When I was a medical student, melanoma was a death sentence. And in England, when judges pronounce the death sentence, they put on a black cap. And seeing this black melanoma had that feeling for me. But the surgeon, to whom incidentally I dedicate the book, immediately reassured me and said that melanomas in the eye are much more benign. And he said in the old days they would take the eye out, but now one could irradiate it and laser it and preserve vision and probably never hear from it again. This was done, and I enjoyed some vision with that eye. There was a part missing. When I looked up at my 5-bladed fan, I only saw 4 blades, and then later I only saw 3 blades, and things started happening. Finally, vision in that eye became so distorted that I would close it voluntarily. In particular, people became attenuated, insect-like creatures, slightly tilted to one side. My journal in my book has pictures. I'm not very good at drawing. They're rather Thurber-like pictures. And anyhow, you'll see my picture of what happened to human beings. You'll say, but this was only with the right eye, but it somehow infected vision altogether. Then in June of '07, I lost all central vision in that eye, and it was something of a relief to me, although rather terrifying. In the evening of the lasering, I took off the dressing and I looked in the mirror and I couldn't see my head. I could only see from here down. Now, losing central vision in that eye, I lost my especial pleasure and pride, which was stereo vision. I don't know how visible this will be. Oops, if I can find what I want. Well, there's a picture here. Here I'm pouring a glass of wine for a friend, but as you see, I miss the glass and pour it in his lap. In those early days when I lost stereo, I would go to shake hands with someone and I would miss their hand by 6 inches or so. Losing stereo, I think, affected me especially seriously because I'd been so passionately stereo before. And I think I probably come to rely on binocular cues and less on things like perspective and occlusion, which you have with one eye. 4 years later, I've made some accommodations to this, but only some. I carry a stick basically because I can't judge sometimes how far things are away or the depths of curbs. If all of you were to close one eye, or hold your hand over one eye, I wonder what your responses would be. I think responses are very varied. When I was a 10-year-old at school, the teacher found me closing one eye and then the other, and she said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm experimenting." I said, "When I close one eye, the world gets completely flat, and when I open it, it opens like a piano accordion." With 9 people out of 10 don't have this so abruptly, but everyone in the New York Stereoscopic Society had this. We were all super stereo people, and I had gone in a flash from super stereo to non-stereo. I sometimes, if dreams can afford reliable testimony, I sometimes have stereo dreams. And when I wake up to the appallingly flat world I'm in, where there's a sort of visual chaos that looks as if the fan is about to hit my reading lamp, I know that they are 6 feet apart, but I can't see that 6 feet of apartness. There is no distance between everything. It's all flat and on one plane. Although I will say there are occasional advantages, one advantage I think is that I've become more sensitive to paintings and photographs because, of course, these depict a 3-dimensional world on one plane. Before this happened, I used a stereo camera myself, and my sense was very much of objects in space at different distances. And now for me, there are just outlines all on the same surface. This can produce many strange illusions. I'm going to just find another page in the journal. Yeah. Another one of my peculiar pictures there. An appalling sight this morning in the parking area at Chelsea Piers. An enormous truck on top of my car. My immediate feeling was, my God, they allow things like this. My first feeling was of a hideous accident, that the truck, in its folly, I have difficulty reading my own writing, became impaled on my car and would be crushing it by its weight. And then I realized that the truck was the other side of the garage, but I couldn't see that it was 30 yards behind my car. It was just sitting on my car. This sort of illusion is, well, perhaps some of you have this. But I still had a little peripheral vision, and that was very important. Then 2 years ago, I bled into the eye, which took away all vision. I didn't think it would make much difference. I thought, well, there was only a little peripheral vision there anyhow, but it made a lot of difference because then I found I couldn't see to the right. I'm going to read a little bit. Again, when things happen, you kid yourself it's nothing. One of those things, I thought. Although it was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. It will clear in a few minutes, but it didn't clear. It grew denser and denser. On Monday morning, Kate, who works with me, came over and suggested we go for a walk together. As soon as we emerged into the morning bustle of Greenwich Avenue, crowded with people balancing coffee cups and cell phones, people walking dogs, parents with children going to school, I realized that I was in trouble. I was startled, even terrified, because people and objects suddenly seemed to materialize, to loom at me on the right side without any warning. Had Kate not been walking on my right, protecting my blind side, I would have been colliding with everything, tripping over dogs, crashing into strollers, without the least awareness that they were there. Normally, one's peripheral vision alerts one to what's happening. It may not be conscious, but you keep your distance, you know what's going on. And if something important is going on, then you turn your eyes so you focus in with central vision. But I wasn't getting any sort of clue. I am not getting any sort of clue, which is why I am not disturbed by this thing on my face. Because not only can I not see it, but there's a sort of neglect of the right. I don't entirely believe that there's anything on my right. So let me, if I can, so when Kate and I came back from the walk, I've got 2 pages stuck together. I can't find what I want. I got into the elevator, and for some reason Kate didn't get in with me. I assume she was checking the mail or talking to the doorman. And then her voice said, "When do we start?" And with difficulty, amazement and difficulty, I turned round and saw that she was already in the elevator. Now, it wasn't simply that I had failed to see her, but it didn't occur to me that she would have come in. And this business of neglect is quite striking. And anyone who is missing an eye or missing in central vision of one eye has this peculiar bisection, well, this peculiar half of the world. I shouldn't call it a bisection, because when you are this way, you think your visual fields are full. But what's out there is nothing and nowhere. And you have to be sort of super conscious and vigilant and consciously make yourself turn to check. And of course, if you don't have any visual field beyond there, you can't just move your eyes, you have to turn your body. And that makes people nervous. They say, why is he turning around and staring at us? So anyhow, my memoir, illustrated with Thurber-like drawings, is also in the book. So they're the three ladies I mentioned originally, and I loved all of them. And originally, I was going to write a little book called Three Women, with Sue and Pat and Lillian. But then I started having the trouble with my own eye, and I also then got a very interesting letter from a novelist, a very good crime novelist in Canada called Howard Engel. And he described to me how the previous summer he'd gone down to breakfast, he felt fine, he went to get the newspaper, the Toronto Globe and Star, which looked fine as it was lying on his doorstep, but when he brought it closer, he found it unintelligible. He said it seemed to be written in Serbo-Croat or something. His first thought was that it was indeed an esoteric edition of the paper put out for a minority community in Toronto. His second thought was that this was an elaborate gag which had been arranged by his friends. But when he opened the paper and saw the entire thing was in this unintelligible script, which he called Serbo-Croat, he didn't read Serbo-Croat. Indeed, I don't know whether there is a written Serbo-Croat. But this was his way of saying it wasn't intelligible. He began to fear that something had happened to his brain. He went into his library as a writer. He had thousands of books and in several languages. Now they were all in unintelligible Serbo-Croat. If this happened to any of you, we live in a world full of signs and letters, notices of every sort. But if you're a writer and you can't read your own books, he went along, he woke his son, who was 12 years old. They went along to a hospital, and there the diagnosis was confirmed that he'd had a small stroke affecting a restricted visual area in his brain, and really knocking out reading, but essentially nothing else. He didn't realize until a nurse suggested it to him. She said, "Why don't you write something?" He said, "I can't write because I can't read." And she said, "Try." She put a pen in his hand, and he signed his name and had no difficulty, and then wrote. And people who have this condition can write perfectly well. It has, like a lot of medical conditions, a Latin name, they call it alexia sine agraphia, inability to read without inability to write. So he then realized that perhaps he could write a book, but what was the use of writing a book if he couldn't read it and couldn't check it? Well, he something rather strange happened, which took him by surprise. I think if I can find it, I will. I will go back to reading. I organized all this so carefully, and now I can't find anything. Wait. Wait, it's. Yeah, I think here we are. I can't find it. I will tell you the story. I am a storyteller. Most of them are maybe 3/4 true. And sometimes almost completely true. Howard found that he was starting to read a little bit. And he got very excited and asked the neurologist to check him over. And the neurologist found not a trace of normal reading ability. So what was happening? We put this together, which wasn't entirely easy because this was largely unconscious. Howard had taken to copying the shapes of letters, easier if it was handwriting than print, with his finger. He would just sort of go along like this, and basically, in a way, writing or copying with his finger. And then this spread to his tongue, and he would copy what his eyes were scanning on the roof of his mouth or the back of his teeth. I've said that people who lose reading still have writing. So for him, essentially, he was reading by writing with his tongue on the back of his teeth. It's still sort of slow, but he can get through a Dickens book. It may take him a month, whereas it would have taken him 2 days before. But I found this very amazing, and it brought home to me that there are always ways, and there are nearly always ways, round a problem. You may not think of them yourself, but your brain somehow does so. By accident, you will stumble on something like this, as Lillian, the pianist, really had stumbled on the preservation of color and using color to organize a world. A particular part of the brain is damaged, has to be damaged, if one is going to lose the ability to read. And it is damaged in everyone who has this problem. So it almost seems as if there is a reading center, a part of the brain dedicated to reading. But one feels, how can this be? Because writing was only invented 5,000 years ago. There isn't time for evolution to work. One can understand how there might be special areas for facial recognition, because that will go right back, and monkeys and apes have to recognize one another, but reading is a cultural achievement. In the 1860s, Wallace, who was the co-discoverer of natural selection, was very puzzled by this very thing, and in general by what human beings could do. For Wallace, natural selection, as he said, would only produce a brain a little better than that of an ape. And for Wallace, adaptation anything developed in evolution would be immediately useful. But how could you explain the ability to read or make music which might only appear, shall we say, 500,000 years later, when people became cultured? Well, in fact, a part of the brain which is specialized for recognizing shape and scenery, and which does this through a vocabulary of shapes, is trained by learning to read. The brain of a literate person is different from the brain of an illiterate person. And for me, learning about this was the first example of how learning and how culture has altered our brains. I'm going to talk a little bit about something else, which is recognizing faces. Again, I'm going to read something from the book. It is with our faces that we face the world, from the moment of birth to the moment of death. Our age and our sex are printed on our faces. Our emotions, the open and instinctive emotions which Darwin wrote about, as well as the hidden or repressed ones which Freud wrote about, are displayed on our faces, along with our thoughts and intentions. Though we may admire arms and legs, breasts and buttocks, it is the face, first and last, which is judged beautiful in an aesthetic sense, fine or distinguished in a moral or intellectual sense. And crucially, it is by our faces that we can be recognized as individuals. I have had difficulty recognizing faces for as long as I can remember. I didn't think too much about this as a child, but by the time I was a teenager in a new school, it was often a cause of embarrassment. My frequent inability to recognize schoolmates would cause them bewilderment and sometimes offense. It did not occur to them, why should it, that I had a perceptual problem. Then, at the age of 78, it says 76 here, but that was when I originally wrote this, despite a lifetime of trying to compensate, I have no less trouble with faces. I'm thrown particularly when I see people out of context, even if I've been with them 5 minutes before. This happened one morning just after my appointment with my psychiatrist. I'd been seeing him twice weekly for many years at this point. A few minutes after I left his office, a soberly dressed man greeted me in the lobby of the building. I was puzzled as to why this stranger seemed to know me, until the doorman addressed him by name. It was, of course, my own analyst. This failure to recognize him came up as a topic in our next session. I think he did not entirely believe me when I maintained that it had a neurological basis rather than a psychiatric one. Well, I often apologize to a large, clumsy, bearded man walking towards me, and I'm afraid we will collide, and then I realize that it's a mirror. And sometimes things can happen the other way around. There's a cafe, or there was a cafe in Chelsea Market I was rather fond of. It had tables outside. And once I was having lunch there and turned to the window. It's like many people with a beard, I started grooming myself. And then I realized that my reflection was not grooming itself, and that, and indeed, it was not grooming itself, but looking at me oddly. There was, in fact, a grey-bearded man on the other side of the window who must have been wondering why I was preening myself in front of him. Kate often cautions people in advance about my little problem. She tells visitors, don't ask if he remembers you, because he will say no. Introduce yourself by name and tell him who you are. And to me, she says, don't just say no. That's rude and will upset people. Say, I'm sorry, I'm awful about recognizing people. I wouldn't recognize my own mother. I did recognize my own mother, usually. Well, I have an older brother. I had an older brother who had gone to Australia when I was a teenager. And I met him again for the first time in more than 30 years in 1985. And I found that he had exactly the same problem with faces and also with places. He was a doctor in Sydney, and his wife would always bring in the chart on a patient before the patient came in, because she knew that he would fail to recognize the patient, even if he'd seen the patient the day before or the week before. And I was a little puzzled by this and started to wonder whether this could be a family thing or a genetic thing. Prior to that, I just thought of it as a sort of idiosyncrasy, and in fact, I thought it might have been due to absent-mindedness or not paying attention. I didn't quite know what it was. In 85, 86, when my book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, came out, I started to receive a lot of letters from people who said that they also had problems of recognition, not as bad as Dr. P, but that their problems were lifelong. For example, here was one letter in 91. A woman wrote to me saying, I believe that 3 people in my immediate family have visual agnosia, my father, a sister, and myself. We each have traits in common with your Dr. P, but hopefully not to the same degree. My father was unable to recognize his wife in a recent photograph. At a wedding reception, he asked a stranger to identify the man sitting next to his daughter, my husband, of 5 years at the time. I have walked by my husband while staring directly at his face on several occasions without recognizing him. Unlike Dr. P, I feel I can read people well on an emotional level. This was one of dozens of letters I started to get, and I began to wonder. Neurologists had written about sudden loss of ability to recognize faces as a result of a stroke or a head injury. But here were people saying they were born this way and that it had been lifelong. I wondered whether there was a condition, a lifelong condition of being unable to recognize faces, which was being disregarded, which had never attracted either medical or public attention. And then in 2005 or something like that, I found that a colleague at Harvard had sent out electronic questionnaires to more than 50,000 people and had examined a good many of them. And he had come to the conclusion that somewhere between 2 and 3% of the population were fairly severely face blind, enough to get into trouble and to need help, even though some of them might not realize it because they had become so good at recognizing people by their clothing, their movements, the way they walked, their voice, their context, or whatever. And 2 to 3% means 5, 6, 7 million people, including, no doubt, 2 to 3% of all of you. And so here again, I partly wrote about face blindness, my own and other people's, because I thought this was a topic which needed to be talked about. There are a number of topics which have been secret. No one talked about dyslexia a few years ago. Now it's known that a substantial minority of children have dyslexia, and sometimes heightened visual or musical abilities going along with the dyslexia, and there are forms of teaching which make life much easier for them. There need to be something for the face blind. I am usually helped with by Kate or someone. I really have to have a recognizer with me, but that's a problem. And quite a common one. And again, there is a particular part of the right hemisphere which is concerned with the identification and the representation of faces. If people have hallucinations of faces, which is something I will be writing about one of these days, you find activity in this face area heightened. And you can show it's a face area by putting people in a functional brain imaging and showing them photos, and the area will immediately spike when they see a face. So seeing faces seems to be built in evolutionarily, but it also depends on early life. Now, I haven't been watching the time, and well, there are. Oh yeah, I should say, because I shouldn't leave things in a negative way. The other side of face blindness are super recognizers. And let me read you another letter. As I get older, I maybe see fewer patients. I often take 2 hours to see a patient, and there's a limit to how many patients I can see. But I get hundreds, indeed thousands of letters. Here's a letter from someone, Alexandra Lynch. She said, "It happened again yesterday. I was on my way down into the subway in Soho when I identified someone 15 feet ahead of me, back turned, talking intimately with a friend, as a man I knew or had seen before. I had last seen him briefly 2 years earlier at an opening in Midtown." And she goes on to say, "This is an integral part of my life. I catch a passing glimpse of someone, and with no real effort, flash, place the face. Yes, that's the girl who served us wine at an East Village bar last year." Anyhow, people like this have indelible memories of faces and may have tens of thousands of faces, and they need to be employed by the CIA. Their gift can cause trouble as well, because they recognize strangers who become suspicious and say, we've never met before. And she said, "Yes, we did, 32 years ago in that little alley in Florence." And then they think they may have been tailed, or she has something against them. So in fact, there's a whole spectrum. Most people are in the middle, but down at one end are people like me or worse, and they come much worse than me. And at the other end are the super recognizers. Now I think at this point, it's a little after 8 o'clock. I should stop and be open to your questions. but thank you very much for your attention. I hope my deaf friends will feel free to answer questions as well, which would be interpreted to me and my answer back to them. And Haley, who works with me, will help me with your questions because I'm rather deaf, as well as rather blind and rather lame. I hope the central nervous system is roughly intact. Hi, Haley.
So we have some microphones up here in the front of the auditorium. If you'd like to ask a question, please come up and speak clearly and closely into the microphone.
Dr. Sachs, in your discussion of stereo Sue, you made the point that you thought it was important to write about because you suggested that somehow or other things could be improved in people, which suggests that there's some mechanism that you're suggesting that could do this in someone who didn't have stereo vision.
What was the last question?
You're suggesting that there's a mechanism that can be improved if you don't have stereo.
Right. It seems probable that stereo Sue, like many people born with a severe convergent squint, might have had a little stereo vision when she was young. When I brought this up, she said, yes, sometimes as a child, a blade of grass would seem to stick forward. But then she'd lost that and more or less forgotten about it until I brought this up. You have to have two good eyes. Some people who have a strabismus may lose the sight in one eye. The brain may suppress the sight in one eye. But the alternate is you have good sight in both eyes. And then it really may require quite elaborate training. Sue herself has written about this. But there are, the brain essentially has to have two pictures, images corresponding to what the two eyes see. And the differences between these two pictures are interpreted as depth. And when stereoscopes were invented in the 1830s, originally they would have geometrical drawings, a cube slightly tilted in one drawing, a scene, and so on. If you look into a stereoscope, you see two flat pictures, a flat picture with each eye, but the brain will compare them and you have a single picture in depth. If that mechanism is intact, and perhaps it would survive in everybody, even if they didn't have any stereo vision when they were very young. If that mechanism is intact, seemingly it will work if you can align the eyes. But it's, no promises can be made, and this is not easy, but life is much more fun in 3D than 2D. Even though there are 2D athletes and aviators and surgeons, it's amazing what one can do with one eye if that's all you ever had, but still two eyes are better.
I'd like to ask you what happens, or have you seen any 3D films? And if so, how does your problem with your right eye, how is that affected, or is it?
Can you watch 3D films?
No, I can't. I haven't seen Avatar. I used to adore 3D films. And in my piece, Stereo Sue, I talk about some of the 3D films which appeared in the 1950s, which thrilled me. But now if I wore the stereo glasses, I would get two images which would confuse me and wouldn't fuse. I have to see I have to see a 2D version of a 3D film.
I have a question from a pure medical standpoint in terms of treatment modalities for people that have certain conditions where they can't recognize faces. I think there are new drugs that are coming out which target like histone bodies and other such things in the brain that can affect how our genes are coded for how our brain functions. They're also doing this for like psychiatric disorders. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this and where medicine might be going with that.
I haven't caught a word of this.
Yeah.
Can you tell me, give me the gist of what was said?
So treatments for prosopagnosia.
By the way, this is not you. It is that for me, the amplification system booms. And yeah.
Are there any drug treatments for prosopagnosia, gene therapy or things like that?
Like histone.
Yeah. As far as I know, no drugs. The genetics of face blindness are being investigated, but as yet there is nothing helpful on the horizon. I mean, what is needed is recognition and training and other forms of things, and being able to say, I'm sorry, I don't recognize you, I have a problem. If you don't say that, you will be seen as rude. But so at the moment, there are only sort of behavioral approaches.
Sir, I have a neighbour who was a perfectly healthy man and suddenly started to go blind, and gradually the rest of his body deteriorated to the stage where he's now quadriplegic. I'm told by a colleague that this man has Alzheimer's, first presenting as occipital problem with his vision.
Yeah.
Do you?
He's asking about Alzheimer's.
Yes, well, someone who has Alzheimer's who went blind and is quadriplegic now.
Well, when you have Alzheimer's, you may have difficulty recognizing people and objects, like the man I wrote about who mistook his wife for a hat. You don't go blind as such, but you develop an agnosia, which means you see clearly, but you can't interpret what you're seeing.
This man was a professor at university.
No, I think there are 6 people behind you, and I think we should give them a chance.
A little too short. I was wondering how there have been a lot of studies where when people have different aphasias and agnosias, such as in the Broca's or Wernicke's area, the brain can, like other parts of the brain will kind of pick up where those areas leave off. But in a lot of the cases with like the agnosias for the face blindness that you're talking about, that such thing doesn't really exist. It's all like conscious efforts to try to, get over with this issue. So what are your thoughts? Like I was wondering why for some different aphasias and agnosias, other parts of the brain can pick up on that while others can't.
I think that was English, but I'm afraid I didn't catch a word. Instantly, I'm sorry, you're getting a demonstration of what deafness is like. And it's not just amplitude. So what did the young lady say?
So if I'm paraphrasing this right, that there are ways that the brain will compensate for like Broca's aphasia, but why doesn't it do that for prosopagnosia? Why do they have to be sort of conscious?
Right. The brain can only compensate to some extent. There's a fairly small area which has become specialized for face recognition, and if that's knocked out, it's knocked out. Again, I wrote about this in an earlier book, there are particular areas of the brain, of the visual cortex, which are specialized for the perception of color and also the imagination of color, and if those are knocked out, there's no way around this unless there's some healing. But at the moment, there doesn't seem to be that much adaptation of the brain there.
Early in your presentation, you mentioned, I think it was stereo Sue, who went to a therapist who asked her a bunch of questions. And then after that, she walked out and her steering wheel popped up into her face. As a result, the way you presented it, it was after these questions were asked, she suddenly saw in stereo. I'm very curious as to the relationship between the questions and her sudden ability to be able to see in stereo.
Okay, why did the steering wheel sort of suddenly pop out at Sue?
Well, the steering wheel, I mean, until that point, the steering wheel had been flush with the dashboard. And as she remarked to the snow, and as I have now, everything used to be in a flat plane. But with stereo vision, things are not on a flat plane. They protrude or they retreat in the third dimension. And she was experiencing for the first time the steering wheel looking as it should look.
I'm sorry, but I don't think that my question was properly interpreted.
So
I want to know what the therapist that she saw that afternoon before she went to drive her car
I see. Yeah, I'm sorry.
asked her that enabled her to suddenly be able to see in stereo.
Right. Okay. She had was being given exercises to get the two eyes to move together and in alignment and congruously. These were quite complex exercises which she had been doing for a time. And at that point, she had achieved alignment of the eyes, although it was rather brief and unstable. But when she got into the car, her then aligned eyes allowed her to see it in stereo. But you would have to find the details in her book.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you. I work with Asperger kids, and I'm curious about when you say superconscious, is it the same thing as that I see over and over again? For example, this kid curses all the time, and I'm taking him to a pizza place. I say, hey, look, if you curse, I'm going to be kicked out. We're going to be kicked out of this pizza place. And he's going, no, I'm not going to curse. I am not. I said, how do you know you're not going to curse? Well, I know. And what happens is that he puts his mind up to this higher level, this super level that we may look at as normal, but these kids will just have their mind, they'll kick their minds up to another level, and they will act just fine. And I'm just wondering, does that relate to your superconscious?
he's talking about Asperger kids, and I'm not 100% sure that I actually understand.
Like he
your
used the
question.
word superconscious, and it seems like these kids will raise up the intensity of their mindset so they could, a better example, a hyperactive student, a client of mine, he's going out with a girl, and he says, I said, well, you know, he calls himself hyperactive. He said, oh, I'm not going to be hyper with the girl. I don't want the girl to know I'm hyper. And he could control his hyperactivity because he kicks his mind up to that level because it's so important to him.
If I understand you, you could be speaking about Tourette syndrome when there are sudden explosive movements and words, and often cursors. Now, I saw a colleague, a surgeon in Canada, who had very severe Tourette's, and but had been completely accepted by the community. One of the things he tended to say was, hideous, hideous, hideous. And I was with him in an outpatient's when a man came in with a condition which was indeed hideous. And I feared that he might say this. What happened was he would just say, hit. Somehow consciousness allowed him to abbreviate the word so it didn't have its usual sound. And if this is what you're asking about, yeah, okay.
that kind of alexia have difficulty perceiving numerals, logos, icons, etc.?
Does the alexia affect logos, numerals?
Yes. Well, in fact, there are slightly different parts of the brain. One can have an alexia for music without having an alexia for print, although Lillian ultimately got both. It can be the other way around. You can also have a specific alexia for numerals and for any particular sort of symbolic notation. You can also have an alexia for English, but not for Chinese. But you may say then Chinese is an ideographic language and is quite different. But you can have an alexia in English and not in French. And sort of there's not only, so there is exquisite specialization within the specialization.
We're going to take these last three people for questions.
Dr. Sachs, one of your quotes in one of your books was, if a man has lost a leg or an eye, he knows he has lost a leg or an eye. But if he has lost himself, his own sense of self, he cannot notice because he's no longer there to notice. And you were talking about a brain-injured patient. I 10 years ago, happened to have my temporal lobe and hippocampus removed. I had brain surgery. You were talking before about something called Capgras syndrome. That's a disease that I have as well, where familiar people you see every day appear unfamiliar. And unfamiliar people that you've never met or mere acquaintances appear familiar. And that's because the right side of the brain kind of overcompensates for the left side of the brain. And that's my case. When one side outweighs another, the unfamiliar may look familiar, but the familiar look unfamiliar.
She has Capgras.
And you taught me about, that's called Capgras syndrome, and I learned that through you and Dr. Oren Davinsky. And you were talking about facial recognition and the off-balance in the brain.
It's all about Capgras.
Right, she's a patient of Oren's.
Oh, I see, well, there are a number of paradoxical seeming conditions. One of them, which was described about a century ago, has the effect of making those nearest and dearest to one, in some sense, unfamiliar. You recognize them, but there is not the appropriate feeling of warmth. And because of this, sorry.
It's there.
Okay. And because of, I can hear a whistling sound, but they can't. No, it's okay then. Now, if someone looks just like your husband or wife or child, but you don't have the feeling you used to have or the feeling you should have, then you might say perhaps they are imposters, perhaps they are duplicates. You do not get this with strangers or people you don't know terribly well, because there's no special emotional bond. But it's really, it seems to be the dissonance between a visual recognition, a perceptual recognition, but an emotional breakage, as if there's something broken or not connected between the visual and the emotional centers. And I think it must be quite difficult to live with, and I think you must be brave and resourceful to be doing so.
The other side is the hyper-familiarity, where people you don't know appear to be extremely familiar, as if they're your friends.
Hyper-familiarity, incidentally, people with face blindness, myself included, on the one hand, we cut our closest friends. We may also embrace strangers. I was at a party recently, and when the door was opened, I I said to my hostess, lovely, see you again, and kissed her. And she said, she says, your hostess is over there. But there is a syndrome in which everyone seems familiar, although you know this can't possibly be so. Your intellect will tell you that you can't get on a bus and have met everyone there, and yet you may feel that. And so the sense of familiarity and memory are different. But that too is very intriguing. And you're in very good hands with Dr. D, the best.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask if it's physically possible to have a modicum of stereo vision with one eye, or whether the fact that when I cover an eye, I see very little difference between one eye and double. Does that mean I have very low stereo vision, or is it just my brain compensating, knowing what I should see?
Can you have any stereo vision with one eye? You're asking if you can have stereo vision
Yeah.
with only
Is it possible, because I have essentially the same depth perception with one or two? How do you explain that?
So she feels like she has depth perception with one eye, the same as with two. And she's asking if that's just compensation or some other mechanism, or if that's actually stereo vision with one eye.
Well, I've had a lot of letters from people who have lost one eye but maintained that they somehow regained stereo vision. I suspect that this is an illusion, and a very nice illusion, made possible by the fact that monocular cues of perspective and occlusion and so forth have been heightened. I don't know what else to say. I wish I were one of them, but for myself, things remain as flat as a playing card, except in dreams, and except I will confess on a couple of occasions when I smoke some pot. When some flowers I was looking at seemed to thrust out towards me.
Thank you, I'll try that.
It didn't last.
What are you planning to write next?
Oh, what are you writing next?
I've just finished writing a book on hallucinations. I finished on Thursday, and I got word from my editor today that he liked it, and I hope it will come out next year.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sachs.
Yeah.